everybody. Welcome to the start of a new season in Pakhuis de Zwijger, the season in which this venue celebrates its 10th anniversary. And we're going to start this season of conversation with, well, a very good one, I promise. This evening is part of a series of conversation on democracy. And tonight we will investigate the manifestation of expulsion in cities, the phenomenon that Saskia Sassen describes in her latest book called Expulsions. Of in het Nederlands uitstoting, niet in het meervoud, maar in het enkelvoud. En Saskia moedigt u allen aan om, als u dat verstaat, hem in het Nederlands te kopen, omdat ze de uitgever, de Vlaamse uitgever, heel graag wil steunen. Dus koop het niet in het Engels, in die neoliberale taal, hè? Maar koop hem in het Nederlands, want dan maakt u Saskia Sassen heel erg blij. Ik kan dit ook allemaal in het Nederlands zeggen, want onze gast verstaat Nederlands. Goed. Good. She will be our keynote speaker, of course, Miss Saskia Sassen. And together with Sheila Foster and Christian Iaione, who will join us through Skype, we will discuss her book and her analysis on the city and the consequences of the city and what we can do with the concept of the commons and how that interacts with each other. We will ask the question, it's going to be an analytical evening, can the transformation of ownership, the concepts of ownership, can that help us find a response or an answer to the phenomena Saskia Sassen in her work describes. Okay, so we'll start with the keynote, half an hour, then some questions. Then I will interview Sheila Foster through Skype on the notion of the commons. What does that exactly mean if we talk about urban commons? Then Christian Iaione will join me, us on Skype, and Saskia and me will be here on center stage. And we will have a discussion or an exploration. And then at the final half hour, the alderman Arjan Vliegendhart and the social entrepreneur Jeroen Jonkers will join us on stage. And we'll see what consequences this analysis has for the government, for governing, for organizing Amsterdam. With this series, New Democracy, and I see a lot of familiar faces, it's about the 8th night, and some of you have visited them all or a few of them. We investigate democracy or democratic change as a transition. We're looking for socio-economic trends, which we have to understand what kind of challenges democracy faces today. And we're discussing practices of social innovators, entrepreneurs, others, to see how they interact with each other. And they put pressure, of course, on the existing system. And we are trying to understand how that can actually change democracy as we are used to it today in this city. Okay, so let's see if at the end of the evening, at about 10 o'clock, you will have a new perspective on the question on how we can make Amsterdam, cities in general, more inclusive, more righteous, more fair, more democratic. That is the ambition of tonight, and I'll ask you at 10 o'clock whether we've succeeded in reaching that ambition. Okay, it's a great honor to pronounce the keynote speaker of tonight. She's a Dutch-American sociologist, a world-renowned thinker, perhaps even the most famous thinker alive with a Dutch heritage. She's a professor of sociology at Columbia University. Give her a warm Amsterdam welcome, Miss Saskia Sassen.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and it really is a big pleasure to be here. I noticed, Natasha, that you said Sassen. So I have to tell you, yesterday I was with all kinds of politicians in not Paradiso, And the MC kept saying, Sasse. And so at one point I asked, I brutally interrupted him, and I said, what is this Sasse business? At which point the whole room exploded into laughter. And they told me, and I don't know whether they were joking with me or not, but I'm curious. Sasse, to pronounce the N, to not pronounce the N, is the educated way of speaking Dutch. You know, hey, I have no, but anyhow. So I am delighted. I think this is an amazing project which is happening here. I understand this is the 8th or 9th session, and it mixes all kinds of worlds, so that is wonderful. I want to start with a notion about the city and why it matters so much that we keep cities as cities. A lot of densely built terrain today is not a city. We could say that if you were walking the hills of Italy in the Middle Ages and you saw something densely built up, you knew that was a city. But I would say in the last 30 years, and maybe in the last 20 years in some countries, built density is not enough to have a city. So what really is a city? Because we don't really get into the question of what is a city. We assume a city is a city. And to my chagrin, and I really think it is a loss, when you have densely built up terrain that is privately owned, mega projects, big private office parks, that alters something in the city. Given the purposes of your project, I want to emphasize just a couple of things. By the way, I should interrupt myself. Should I speak more slowly? You are all fine with me, right? The Dutch, I know, speak all these languages. I actually speak 6. I grew up in 6, but I don't speak a single one perfectly. That is a very peculiar condition for an academic to be in, but I survived it, luckily. So back to the subject then. So for me, a city is a complex but incomplete event, space, condition. Having said that, I have removed myself sufficiently from a clear notion of the city to have to rediscover what is a city. Second little point sort of to put on the table, think of any big city. I'm sure it also holds for Amsterdam. I know it holds for London, for New York, for Paris. All kinds of very powerful actors, whether they were economic actors, firms, whether they were political modes of controlling, not just individuals, but actual systems, political systems, are gone. They're dead. Most of the firms that operated in London are finished. In New York, finished. But across all these long periods of time, the city and the neighborhoods have survived. And I really want to bring in the neighborhoods. I think that is critical. Most of the residents of cities, perhaps until quite recently, it is changing now, are modest neighborhoods. That is where most of the residents are. Today, again, I repeat, this is changing. When you look at this long historical trend, and you see that what has survived is something that is complex but incomplete. A private office park can be very dense. I think you have a few of those now, right? In Amsterdam, Zuid-Amsterdam or something like that. When that decays, either the buildings fall apart because they're not the highest quality. I'm sure in the Netherlands they are the highest quality, but in many countries they are not. When that decays, there is nothing left. Something will replace it. So there is something about the long history of cities and its neighborhoods. And neighborhoods, I think of neighborhoods as modest places. I'm not talking about chic, central city kinds of places. When I say neighborhood, I mean a modest. It doesn't have to be poor, but modest, not grand. So what does that tell us about cities? And again, I want to emphasize, just density is not enough. It was enough probably until not too long ago. Today it is not enough. Second major point, and that is what I really want to dwell on, is that There is something happening in cities, a new trend, a new circuit that is, I think, a threat to a lot of what has made cities survive across different epochs with different leaderships, different political systems, different enmities and distrust modes inside the cities. You know, you mentioned it, it's all been there in cities. And this is what I really want to focus on. I'm doing research on it, and I entitle it, a bit of a provocation, Who Owns the City? Clearly, a city is not meant to be owned by anybody. A city is a very ambiguous regime of mixed ownerships. Little houses are owned, little this is owned, stores are owned, etc. But really owning the city, yes, if it's a private city, a gated community, or some of these new private cities that are being built. People don't realize, but there are about 400 cities under construction. Those are going to be mostly private cities, and they should not be called cities. I want to preserve this concept that is so familiar to us that we don't even think about it. We just use it, the city, as something that is actually under threat. It's very precious, and it matters, and that is why I think this is just a great project that you have going here. So, in this project that I'm doing on Who Owns the City, I'm looking at a variety of issues. One of them is the buying, and Amsterdam is on my list, the buying of property. I'm not talking development, I'm talking just buying existing property. I want to make a clarification here. A lot of this buying is foreign. I think that is absolutely secondary to the issue. I think what matters is that it is corporate buying. What matters is that a lot of those buildings that are being bought are underutilized. There's something else happening. So a thesis that I'm developing is that what we're really seeing, the heart of the matter of this buying of properties, is the buying of urban land. You cannot go bad, can go wrong, I'm sorry, by buying urban land in today's conditions. Let me give you an example, just as an element, floating element, bit of information. Singapore, a very well-run government, very smart people in the government, just bought a big piece of poor Detroit. They didn't announce it. They didn't say that they were doing anything. Most of the residents who live there, who are often old, unemployed, poor, who slowly are dying or leaving because there's nothing for them to do, they don't know it. But this is something that recurs. I want to just give you some information with some slides. So something is happening. And part of what is happening is that urban land becomes a resource. Regimes of ownership vary considerably. I mean, it's just a mess. A lot of the law that concerns, it's a mess, I'm sorry, I should backtrack. It's a mess because it varies, if you're studying it, it varies across countries and it varies across cities within a country. Partly that is because the regime about urban land is often very old law, whereas buying property often is all kinds of new contracts that are being invented, often by very smart lawyers. So one issue for me that lies behind some of these trends that we're seeing is that the ambiguity of ownership of urban land, because it's old law, often not fully developed law, could be easily smashed. You know what I mean? Broken, destroyed, destabilized, rendered useless by extraordinarily bright, truly brilliant, truly creative lawyers who are working for the big corporations that are buying buildings. And that when they make these contracts, they bring in gradually clauses, items about the ownership of land that begins to crawl into old existing law. Now, because these contracts are very formal, they are contemporary types of contracts, now we may notice this is crawling into older law about urban land as opposed to property on top of the land. But you know what? What I have noticed with these kinds of things, very soon we forget. And the law is that formal contract that is being designed now. I don't know if people are still with me. Am I clear with what I'm saying or not? Oh, nobody said yes, clear. This is not a good sign. But was it clear or not? Otherwise, somebody might want to ask a question very quickly. That's fine with me. We're all doing work here, collective work. So this is not about me holding a lecture. Well, a complex but incomplete system. But, you know, that is and I should say in my practice as a researcher, I make a point. If I want to really understand an X, whatever the X, I need to remove myself sufficiently from the X that I've lost the X, in this case the city, and that I have to rediscover the X. That is why I can't just say the city is the city, nor can I say simply densely built up ground is a city, which is very often people unthinkingly think if it's densely built up, it's a city. I'm trying to recover a working concept that truly marks a mix of elements that go well beyond the question of density. And I repeat, until quite recently, density was enough. You know, you just needed that. Today, a lot of density is, you know, office parks that are privately owned. Nothing happens there. That is not about... Well, I should add, as a second qualification of the city, when I, for instance, ask myself, what are the spaces today where those without power get to make a history, a culture, an economy? The city is one of the very few spaces. You know, in times past, the big mines, the big plantations were spaces where those without power, just because of the large numbers, could actually make a politics. They could fight against the owners. Today, the plantations, the mines, are militarized. So that is no longer a space where, you know, remember the epoch of making unions, labor unions. There was a time when certain situations where you had a lot of workers under the control of one firm was an opportunity to mobilize, to organize. Today it's very difficult, and certainly those traditional places of the 1800s, you know, where a lot of militancy was happening, the big plantations in the Caribbean, in Africa, and a whole variety of places, that is gone. So to me the question is, today, what are the spaces where those without power get to make a history? And history and economy, you know, I don't want to limit it to history. It's sort of a variety of elements. The city is one of those spaces. That is why I mentioned that across time, the neighborhoods have continued to be live spaces. Those are spaces, modest spaces. Now, a given neighborhood may be inhabited by many different types. Certainly you see that in some cities like London and New York, different immigrant groups, different religions. That's great. But they have survived. And today, of course, with gentrification going sort of hyper and other modes that are negative modes, they are at threat. We already know that. There are some cities where the center is simply for the rich. Manhattan is that way to a very large extent, not completely. So, I hope that I gave you some sort of... Was there another question that somebody had about... Yes?
Nobody can hear you, sorry. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I was wondering, like the connection between like the modest neighborhoods and the big corporations and the lawyers, like... what would you say, like, don't the big corporations want to be in the center of the cities and not in those modest neighborhoods?
Yeah. Well, Singapore is the case that I described about Singapore, this is a very unusual situation, Detroit. People are aware of that, right? It is, and so the image also is very devalued land. So let me just start answering with the Detroit case because it's a concrete case. Whenever I mention this, even to people who are experts, they are very surprised. And I repeat, it's not like I violate laws of confidentiality, but it's a contract had to be signed. And because there is a contract, since I'm doing research on this with legal scholars, I know something, right? So I'm not violating any law. But the point is that Detroit is, Singapore is simply waiting till the last elderly, unemployed, young, whatever it is, leave. The image that we have of Detroit is of a destroyed space, right? Singapore knows better. That is a very valuable place, which has lost all it had, so that's great, right? Why? Because the larger region where Detroit exists is one of the best organized with a lot of high tech, very rich area with lots of universities. It's just Detroit, which was a city of blacks, where blacks got jobs, where blacks unionized, etc., that has been allowed to die. This is a brutal history that starts with many different things, the auto companies, offshoring production, etc. So what you have right now, that is like a mini moment, a mini cosmos, if you want, of a larger process, which is the valuing of a certain sort. I don't mean valuing necessarily positive here, but the understanding that urban land, whatever its shape, is of value in certain regions, not necessarily all over the world. So that is sort of to me, that was a kind of a discovery when I found out, but it fit in with other things that I'm seeing in this research that I'm doing. Now, I want to just make sure that second point, not just the city as complex but incomplete, but also this notion that the city is one of the spaces where those without power can get to be makers. So the image that one might use is if you're a low-wage worker in a private office park, you get to work there. You go in, and when your work is done, you go out. In the city, if your workspace also is, a neighborhood or in the center of the city, some shops, etc., you can begin to, or stuff can happen there that cannot happen in a private office park, which are really almost militarized. It's mostly police or private guards who control those spaces. Now, I don't know what you have here in the Netherlands. You know that in Amsterdam, etc., there is the big South, Amsterdam-Zuid, no? I think that's the name for it. That seems to me probably a somewhat controlled space. I don't know that. But it is certainly different from a neighborhood when it comes to modest people organizing, thinking. So when a city has more and more of that privatized land, it is shrinking the space where those without power can actually get to make a history. And the third point about the city that is also extremely important and that is also threatened by this privatizing is that the city is a frontier space. Today, when I think of the frontier zone, it's not in Africa, in the less populated area, because that's now, owned by all kinds of international governments and firms that are buying it up. It's controlled by the mines. It's controlled by plantations. There is the old frontier. Let me backtrack here a bit and say, when I think of a frontier space, I think of a space where actors from different worlds have an encounter for which there are no established rules of engagement. And that can be death for the weaker party, our history of empire, but it can also be freedom for those without power. There's a positive there. So when I say that our big cities, I don't know about small towns, that's different, but our big cities are where the frontier is today, what I'm also saying is that the powerless can actually confront power, engage power which is increasingly, when you think of economic power, privatized, elusive, where is it? the city, especially global cities, of which we have about 100, which are articulators of a global economy, the city contains within it one moment in the trajectories of these new economic actors, where they actually hit the ground, and power becomes concrete. It becomes men and women who want it all and get it all. And thereby they make themselves present. But if it is a real city, those without power can also say, and I love to invoke the Latin American speech act, estamos presentes. We're present. We're not asking anything from you. We're just letting you know that we are present, that this is also our city. So that is what the city enables. That doesn't happen in an office park. So in that sense, the city has these three elements that I have now described about what is a city really matter, I think, the most for those without power. Those with power, they can do whatever. But those without power, the chance to keep on making histories. I must say, in what I think is my best book, which took me 10 years. It was at the University of Chicago. I literally became a monk. A monk, beautiful. Not a nun, monk. Very different. And the University of Chicago is, like they say, it's the last real German university in the world. I think they're right. Everybody's so intellectual, forever. So I know that at one point, for instance, I was looking at medieval Europe to try to understand current developments in how states, organize their whatever, it doesn't matter. And so I had a lot of books on medieval Europe, which is really a great literature, much better, I must say, than the literature on globalization. And I was just dwelling. For 2 years, I just was there in medieval Europe, and then I got a call from the University of Chicago Library saying, Professor Sassen, you have now checked out 2,000 books on medieval Europe. There are some professors at the university who would also like to see those books. So we are sending a truck now, today. And they did. They sent a truck. They unpacked it. That was the University of Chicago. Anyhow, in that best book of mine, my best book, not the best, I asked myself if those without power ever got to make histories, and they have, not always, but they have, but very often on a temporality that is much slower, much longer. It's just a totally different history. And then the way we construct historical epochs often cuts off those longer trajectories. So we lose the fact that those without power also made a history, because they are truncated, because they are the epochs of power rather than other epochal. You know what I'm saying, right? But anyhow, coming back to the work at hand here, so these three features that I have talked about, complex but incomplete. Second, a space where those without power get to make a history, a culture, an economy, etc. And thirdly, that the city, the big city today, is the place where the frontier happens. It's not at the edges of empire as it was in the past. And because it is in a city, it is an ambiguous space. In our history of empire, we basically arrived and we killed the ones who were there, and that was it. That cannot quite happen. It can happen sometimes. Look how blacks got treated in the United States. But there is a limit. And that, again, is something that tells you that those without power, the space of the city is a critical space where something can be done, something can be resisted. Again, I'm not talking about small towns. That's another story. So what I want to show you now are developments that are very problematic, because they threaten this. They are really one of the bigger threats, historically speaking, against this, really long history of cities as those kinds of spaces. I'm assuming this will work. Right. So here is a bit of an introduction, to how much time do I still have? Because I have a way of not knowing time, I must tell you. 13 minutes. Wow, that was precise. Okay, minute one. Okay, 1 minute on this one. We're going to do it that way, to control the matter. So 2 rising urban formats. This, in most of the world, is where we're headed. And I'm not talking about spaces of misery. Huh? This is a term really generated in Latin America, la periferia, the periphery. That's not unreasonable housing. You understand? There is much worse. Huh? And then those extraordinary buildings in the back. Can you see it all, right? So clearly Amsterdam is not in that situation. There's not even enough space here. But a city like New York, even Manhattan, even the rich neighborhoods, I don't know if you've been around there. In the richest neighborhoods, you will see garbage for 2 days on the sidewalks. You will have holes in... It's incredible. New York is a city that on the one hand has all these new high-rise buildings that I will talk about briefly, and on the other hand, at the same time, it can't handle itself anymore. And we're beginning to see that in big cities, certainly in Latin America, where you have an old history of this. Now, so what I want to move on next, now I'm under pressure of time. Okay, minute 2. Very good. One way of disciplining. So I am looking at a list of 100 cities which in the last few years have become objects of desire for investors. This is not simply a utility function. This is extremely important to make that distinction. This is not simply, I have to start my business. That also has happened for a very long time. For instance, when I was writing my Global City book, I was documenting something that nobody had quite understood. In London, you had Dutch companies, Japanese companies, buying buildings in the city of London to hit the continent. Even Dutch companies did that. So London was a platform. The Japanese, whatever, all kinds of nationalities set up businesses in London to access Europe. Interesting. So there was a lot of buying of property then, but that was a very utilitarian mode of operating. Today, it is not. Now, what I'm showing you is not data on what they call site development. When you develop a whole new project, this is simply buying existing property or property that has just been developed, etc. But it is not, it's that. So I'm showing you, the figures are from mid-2013 to mid-2014. You had about $600 billion that just went, national and foreign capital, that bought buildings in the top 100 cities as ranked by those acquisitions. There's a bit of a circular thing there. And just buying property. This is not investment. That is a whole other measure. So the next year, from mid-2014 to mid-2015, that figure had gone up to over $1 trillion. Now, you have to understand that this is just property buying. Huh? It's quite a lot. And eventually I'll show you that this kind of, the real estate assets today in the world account for $217 trillion. And so financialize, it's a whole sort of circle. Now let me just show you some figures. This is total national and foreign investment, and again, it's just buying property. And you can see New York in that 1 year, received 55 billion, 47 million, 47, London, Tokyo, etc. And here you have another kind of distribution, which shows you more, and you see that at the top, a lot of concentration, and then it sort of calms down a bit. If you just look at foreign investment, London is the main buyer, the main object of desire, so to say, and then New York, and you see that, look at Amsterdam, number 9. What is interesting is the rate of increase. See, London and New York, they have been, but look at Amsterdam, 248%. That's big. Now, this is Randstad. This is Amsterdam Randstad. It is not just, but a lot of it has happened also in Amsterdam. And so Sydney, which is this one? Sydney, Australia, no. So Shanghai still is getting a lot, but less than it used to. These are sort of histories, rolling histories. And here again, you have that distribution. When it comes to foreign, a lot of it happens at the top. What I found very interesting was that in Paris, there is quite a bit of buying by national and foreign, and most Parisians are not aware of it. You know, it's just not, in London and New York, it's the talk of the town, not for everybody, but, you know, like look at that, among foreign, Paris is number 2. The buyers, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, I mean, I'm talking, when I mentioned, it's both governments and mostly also private firms buying. So it's a whole different world of buyers from what it is in London. Now, I always like to ask myself, what does this all look like? So I'm just giving you one image. I'm going to give you 2 images, actually. This is one image. This is one Chinese company, and again, the Chinese are big buyers, that's why I keep mentioning them, but they're not the only ones, and I don't have anything against the Chinese, by the way. So I said that very quickly, but I hope everybody understood. So here are, this is the heart of London. There's the city of London, you know, this is very, very valuable terrain. These are mostly landmarked buildings. They can change those buildings, not for a while. So that is in itself interesting. Very good taste. This Chinese company bought very, very well. I mean, that one I think is not very attractive, you know, but hey, these are really, not all of them are landmarked, but many are. Now, I recently had to walk with a journalist of Die Zeit who wanted to do a story on what I was working on. And so I went walking through this area. I don't usually go walking there. And so I would hear the tourists, foreign tourists, you know, saying, look at those beautiful British buildings. No, they're Chinese. You have 12 Rathaus that one company bought. But, you know, the materiality doesn't tell the full story. I find that also very interesting. That's the theorist in me, right? These are very material conditions. When you walk in front of it, you don't know who owns it. You just see a building. We always tend to think that if it's material, it tells the full story. No, it doesn't. Huh? So now, this is another Chinese company which has not as good taste, I would say. They are building 14 of these horrible towers, though it's a very good architect, you know. Oh, you know the architect? Is somebody? Oh, okay, I hope the architect is not in the room. I don't have bulletproof clothing. You know, I once gave a lecture with a bulletproof jacket. It was very uncomfortable. So anyhow, here we had an area called, by the way, Atlantic Yards. This is not the Hudson Yards. Many people confuse the Atlantic, which was really deeply urban. It had modest neighborhoods, but very dense, very active. It had sort of a manufacturing sector that looked modest, but was actually servicing, you know, the museums and a lot of the new fancy architecture. So it's very particular, crafted manufacturing almost. It just looks modest. It's not a big, brilliant, huge, whatever building. And then a lot of sort of middle-class people, modest middle class, who could no longer afford Manhattan. They all are out. And where they went, who knows? And they're being replaced by 14 of these horrible towers. Now, I think that's a loss of urbanity. You have raised the density, but you've actually lost urbanity. I don't know if you're with me on this one. Now, I must say that this Chinese company decided that Atlantic Yards was not quite the name they wanted to keep. And in the English language, a yard often refers to sort of an industrial space. You know, it's a working space. It's a waste. And so they decided to, because they missed the point a bit, they changed the name to Pacific Yard. They kept that industrial element that they wanted to get rid of because this is chic stuff. And they called it Pacific Yard. The Pacific is quite far away from New York, but it is, of course, or so they act, their ocean, right? So anyhow, that was the story. And now they've understood that was a mistake, so they are changing the name again. I'm really looking forward to what is the next incarnation. So now, here are just a few figures. So the top 100 cities by property investment, again, it's really buying. It's not investment, sounds like it has a positive. This is just buying. 10% of the world's population, those 100 cities, 30% of the world's GDP, the cities represent this, 76% of property investment. So what they are generating is a very particular geography that becomes highly valued space that will concentrate, certain operations, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I should say that I've mentioned quite a bit about foreign companies buying, et cetera. I really, to me, it's not an issue of foreign versus national. To me, it's an issue of corporate buying. I don't care what nationality it is. And so people often, this is one point. The second point is that people often say, well, it's gentrification. Yes, there is gentrification in that process, no doubt. My question is, when I say gentrification, I'm sure that something like that is also happening here in Amsterdam. So when I use the term gentrification as an explanation, for me, two things happen. One is, it's an invitation not to think. It's gentrification. We all know what that is. That is also my issue with the city. The city, it's a city. No, we need to really re-enter those concepts. But the other issue is that the question of the national versus the foreign, and the question of gentrification sort of come together in an example that I want to give, and that is the Qatari royals, right, Qatar? They now own more of central London than the Queen of England, which is a very charming story, I find. I really think it's sort of funny and nice. And that tells you something. It is not, to say gentrification simply fails to capture some of the features of what's happening. This is a whole sort of circuit onto itself that we're dealing with here. I hope that I don't need to elaborate too much, because I know I'm probably on minute 5 or 6. I'm cheating. That word is clear, right? Yeah. So now here is a figure, and these wound up. So here, worldwide real estate assets. This is worldwide. This goes well beyond what I have been describing. Assets are nearly 60%, for those of you who are into finance and the financializing of stuff, nearly 60% of the value of all global assets, including equities, bonds, and gold. It's $217 trillion. That's a lot. But let me say, if you look at the value of finance as measured by outstanding derivatives, which is a basic measure, that is over, what is it now? Quadrillion. It's over four times a quadrillion. That is a lot of zeros. It's 3 more zeros than what you see there. You see what I mean? And so finance, of course, has a way of generating value that is on a totally different level. At the same time, just to put global GDP is 270 trillion. I mean, I'm sorry, it's about the same amount of that, 270 trillion. So we're really dealing with relationships that they don't mean very much. This is a zone, these investments and finance and the financializing of all of these properties, it just takes you into a totally different domain from the domain of the actual economy as measured by GDP, as measured by GDP per capita, et cetera, et cetera. So I just wanted to put that in for those who are interested in that. Now, very quickly, this is a map of London property purchased by overseas companies between 2005 and 2024. So it's all the dots there. And I just wanted to, this is a totally different story. It's part of the bigger story. It's an important categorization here. This is shell companies. Do you know about this or not? So a lot of this urban land is being, or urban property, still property, is being bought by shell companies. These are fictitious companies. It might be an individual sets up the shell company in order to, escape whatever identification or violation. It can be both. And so this is in Manhattan. Manhattan is a very concentrated, set of buildings. Those are all properties that are basically involve shell companies. And I wanted to show you, I am just having trouble with this. So, okay. So here are just a few examples. These are all, I'm showing you 2 or 3 famous buildings in Manhattan. Time Warner Center, very fancy. 122 of the 192 condos are owned by people who used shell companies that hid their identities. You get the picture, right? Bloomberg Tower, very fancy. 57% of condos are owned by shell companies. The Plaza, 69% of condos are owned by shell companies. So why does this matter? It matters to the logic of this study that I'm doing, because this is not a utility function. This is something else. This is about storing your capital. This is whatever it might be. So that makes it more disturbing. I don't know if people, are you still with me? Do you understand what I'm saying or not? Okay, great, then I can move on. Now, I think, am I on minute 13? Okay, she grants me 2 more minutes. Now, the other thing that is happening, and I don't see Amsterdam on this list, but maybe there are elements of that, is there is a kind of new market that has been invented. I did this work with the Financial Times, and it basically is, for those of you who are aware, a few years ago, an economist won the Nobel for matching markets. Matching markets are an increasingly common feature, and there's nothing criminal about it, by the way. Think of a university that wants to, University of Leiden, great university, that wants to recruit new doctors for its medical hospital. I don't know if Leiden has a medical hospital. They do, okay. They don't go to an open market. They select particular other institutions. Say they want to bring in foreign talent because they're slightly different diseases, whatever it might be. So they know exactly. So the matching markets is a very common feature. It is not a deviation. It's not the shell companies. It's just a normal thing. Now, one interesting application of this is this new invented housing market, which sets a minimum price. Those prices that you see are minimum price. And frankly, the properties usually are much higher. What does that do? And these are the key cities. There are a few more on the list. What does that do? And by the way, these are the main nationalities of those who are buying. And here, look at Dubai. Dubai is a very different buyer, a different region of the world from the others. So what does this do? This creates a possibility for those who are selling the properties to really overcharge, to keep out potential buyers who in the end would not buy because they don't have the money, etc., etc. The standard property is more like 100 million. But anyway, now very interesting to me, just as a little anthropological detail, look at Shanghai. You think that the world, these are the main, I repeat, the main nationalities that are buying. You think that the world wants to buy in Shanghai, right? Then look at Hong Kong. The main buyers are mainland Chinese. I don't know if I find that very funny. I can see that you don't see that. But this is quite interesting, you know, that the mainland... Yeah, anyhow. Now, maybe it's to control Hong Kong. Who knows? You know, we don't know that. Many of these properties, they're not being used. Same thing with the shell companies that I first started. There's a lot of empty land. Empty buildings. I went to this is a northern... And I will end with this story so that we have a reasonable time left for other speakers. There is a whole set of mansions that have been bought by Russians, by I don't know what, in London. And I wanted to check out, I want to find out local residents, or live also local Brits, very fancy Brits. So I had the mistaken idea of taking a dog of a friend, because you need to spend time there on the street to figure it out. And this is not the Beverly Hills setup, where you have, no. These are actually houses, mansions, but on an avenue. And so I had a lot of trouble with my dog, but anyhow, and nobody was there, empty. Finally, a very elegantly dressed British woman appears with her dog. I didn't know how to handle my dog getting engaged with her dog. And so I was a bit distracted, but my purpose was to get information. And so I said, God, this neighborhood... And she says, it's, and in the dog, he's suffering. And then she says, it's so empty. There are no people here. And I love that, because when you think of Beverly Hills, you know what I'm talking about, Beverly Hills? You know, in California, the fancy film, whatever world, they want to protect themselves, you know, they're behind walls, they don't want. And the rich Brits, it's very funny. I think that Netherlands is that way too. They like people, actually, you know, and they want to see people on the street. Yeah. So I will check out, this is more of that. How many years did it take of not habiting to get that much moss on your... Why does all of this matter? This I just talked about, make a history of culture and economy. And then this other thing. There are moments in the daily routines of a city when we all become urban subjects. Most of the day we are so many other subjects. But, you know, like running to catch the train that gets you home. And so the capacity of the city to generate an urban subject, which is a difficult achievement, I would say. And then also when the city, by making us all urban subjects, can hack, and I mean hack in the original meaning, unsettling an original design, nothing criminal here, can hack all the other more specific subjects we also are. That's nice. Thank you very much.
Yes. Well, yeah. Well, if you want to really grasp or get more information on this interesting thesis you actually have, or research you're doing, these are some of the books she donated to the library of Pakhuis de Zwijger. So, well, find somebody who works here and you can either, well, borrow the book or buy it, and then preferably the Dutch one, huh? Yeah, or the Flemish one. Thank you so much, Ms. Sassen, for this expose on expulsions. Or no, it wasn't really. Why is all you talked about, and you focused a lot on who owns the city, right? What is a city, but also who owns the city. Why is that such a core part of your notion of expulsions? Can you explain it just a little bit before we go to the sky?
Well, they're not necessarily that deeply connected, right? No. But I think that one way of putting it is that the poor, the modest, etc., get sort of expelled. They cease being fully urban subjects. You know, they are sort of reduced to...
Moved away.
Yeah, they don't have an operational space in some of these new, not necessarily the buildings I was describing, but, you know, really the corporate, privately owned office parks are a good example. Yes. They can work there. Yeah. But, you know, unlike a mine 100 years ago where they could then also organize, they don't get to organize there. And so it really means that the actual city space becomes a critical space, one of the few spaces left. I mean, that is sort of the argument for me there. Yeah. The expulsions bit is that, you know, all the talk about, I mean, there is a lot of language, you know, about inequality, but when you think about it, we have always had inequality. Any complex system is going to have inequalities. So the question is, we need to interpolate inequality. We need to say, at what point does the inequality become unacceptable? And that is where we're at now. But to say that inequality is the problem is like a lazy way of dealing with it, frankly. Because when you say, at what point does inequality become unjust, you have to make an argument. You have to demonstrate that. So it is a very different position. And so for me, the extreme moment is when people, conditions, I also talk about dead land and dead water, they simply are expelled from our operational space. We forget they exist. And you have more and more poor people which are going through that. You have more and more dead land. You know, it's a whole set of things. So I see expulsions as a marking dynamic of this particular period that manifests itself, you know, with different degrees of forcefulness. But that certainly is part of our current period. And again, I do think that the climate change story is a critical part of that.
Yes. Yesterday in the Paradiso lecture, you showed a picture of the Aral Sea.
Right.
And in 20 years, you said, actually, look at the brilliance of humanity or human makers. They can actually, well, change a sea into a dead sea, salty thing. They just polluted it. It was gone.
No, I said there is a capability. I use it,
they were used word
and I think capability should be kept neutral.
Yes.
This notion that, like Amartya Sen, who is a dear friend, I love him, but this notion that capability is inevitably positive. I have a lot of trouble with that because capabilities that are positive at time one can become negative. And so I said, us killing, you realize we killed the RLC. We killed the RLC in 20 years. That is impressive.
Yes,
I mean, you have to stand back and say, how did we do that? And so my issue is, if we did that, what else could we do in 20 years, that is on a positive vector? That is a bit the idea here. So we have capabilities, but many of them are not good.
So thank you for that bridge, because of course that was a classical bridge. To go to the capability side of, okay, so this is an analysis of the city, and description of its, how is the city doing actually in this current era. And we want to combine that with an analysis also from a very important academic, and I hope she's at the Skype. Sheila Foster, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. You see me?
Oh yeah, I saw Christian already, yes.
Okay,
hi,
great.
yeah, hi.
Hi. Hi, Saskia.
Let me introduce you to the audience, because you are a university professor at the Albert Walls Professor of Real Estate, Land Use and Property Law at Forum University, you're also the faculty co-director of Fortum Urban Law Center. You are actually a legal scholar, which is helping because... you have to use the mic because, Did you speak? Did
I spoke at an urban law conference, or you were maybe not? Yeah.
Remember? Yes, that's right.
Yeah, that was a great conference, I must say, great.
Okay, yes. So good you're both here.
Yes.
And we already see you also. Let me also introduce you. For some of us who've been going to all these meetings on New Democracy, you're a familiar face. It's Christian Iaione. Are you in Rome now, or where are you? He's silent. He's in Rome. He is the founder of the think tank Laboratory for the Governance of the Commons. He's pioneering with citizens, city governments, students on institutional innovation. Hi, yeah, well, whatever. In general, I'm too slow, yeah. Okay, he's an associate professor of public law at the University of Rome. He's a fellow of the Urban Law Center at Fortum University. And he also directs LabGov. Are you now there? Rome is really slow. Yeah. Okay. But it doesn't matter, change the techniques, because I'm going to talk to Sheila anyway.
That's why Rome was not on the map.
Okay. Miss Foster.
Yes.
Please, we had quite a beautiful introduction of Professor Sassen on how to think of who owns urban land and what is a city. For those of us in the audience who do not really understand yet the notion of urban commons, can you just give us a brief introduction? What are urban commons?
Right. So, first of all, I'm happy to be here, and in particular to be following Professor Sassen. I'm very familiar with her work and love the idea of expulsions. And the question I was asked to speak on today was, how does the idea of the commons and the urban commons kind of respond, or can be a response to expulsion? So I want to try to link those and talk just a minute about what is a commons and urban commons.
Of course.
So let me just start from one of the things that's wonderful about the book Expulsions is that not just the language of expulsion, but that she maps out the logic of expulsions. And we might think about the commons as in some ways the opposite of the logic of expulsion. So if expulsions are privatized wealth, the commons is collective wealth. If expulsions are about exclusion, the commons is about inclusion. If expulsions are about enclosure, the commons are about access and openness to property and resource. And if expulsions are about consumption, as we've seen in her slides today by corporate actors, then the commons is about not consuming but generating goods for human development and human flourishing. So I think that language, as Expulsions, the book Expulsions makes clear, is important in how we talk about the city and the resources of the city that a lot of different kinds of people depend upon. And so when you ask what is the urban commons, it's actually kind of complex, because there's the language of the commons, which I think is an intervention in the kind of expulsive, the logic of expulsion. But there's also a whole conceptual field about what the commons is that's been occupied by a lot of different people, including Garrett Hardin in The Tragedy of the Commons, the Nobel Prize winner Elinor Ostrom, and then I've been writing about the urban commons for 10 years, and most recently Christian and I have written about the city as a commons. And so let me try to just make a few brief points, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Starting with the language of the commons as an intervention, I do think that the way in which social movements and academics, including academics like David Harvey and others on the left, are using the commons is really an intervention into the privatization and commodification of city space and urban goods. A lot of what Professor Sassen just talked about, and the threat of enclosure of those goods in cities by economic elites. And so the commons stakes out a claim to the city and to a host of resources within the city, and even, to the city itself as a public body, as resources that belong to a broader group of urban inhabitants than just the elite, and that should be accessible to a broad range of urban inhabitants. And also, I think the commons, as it's used in the context of the city and the urban commons, is also designed to make a point that spaces in the city and the city itself are ripe for new forms of production and collaboration, and what Christian and I have called polycentric governance, in which, again, a broad swath of urban residents and inhabitants are really central actors in managing and governing city life and urban resources. Now, I'm a property scholar, so for me, part of what I bring to this idea of the commons is the role of property. So we've heard about, I think, the dark side of property rights. And one of the things we've tried to do is to pull on the progressive potential of property rights. In other words, any system of laws and any system of property laws understand that property rights are central to how we allocate essential goods and resources, not just for people that own property, not just for owners, but more particularly, I think, for non-owners. So in American law, we have this thing called the bundle of property rights. And the bundle of property rights is there to signal that property rights are more than just who gets to own, but we allocate all kinds of entitlements. And we structure people's relationships to resources in the language of property. So when we're talking about property or property rights, we're almost always talking about the structure of, or the architect of community and people's place in it. So, and property rights as well, I think, are fundamental to questions of inequality. The people that have not had property rights need them, I think, to obtain the goods and to secure the goods necessary really to flourish, and that property shouldn't just be about protecting the rights of those who have the most of it. So at the heart of the urban commons is this idea that we need to think about things, goods in cities through a different lens than private property rights, than privatization, but to protect not just the material assets, but immaterial assets, including the relational interests of communities to particular resources in cities. And so the urban commons, so let me ground that a bit. So that's kind of the intervention of the language of the commons, and getting a bit to what on the ground we think about as the urban commons. Again, conceptually, it's somewhat complicated, but here's where we come down on the urban commons. Here's where my work has come down and where Christian and I have written about. One thing to think about in terms of the commons is to think about open access, natural resources, and that's what Elinor Ostrom has written about, and Garrett Hardin. And these are resources in which everyone has rights of inclusion, and no one can be excluded. When we map that onto cities or talk about the commons in the cities, that's not the way we think about commons. Of course, there are some classic kinds of commons in cities, parks, squares, roads, for instance, which are open and accessible to everyone. But what we mean is that there are some commons, urban commons, that are identified by their relationship to the surrounding community, whether the community is at the level of the scale or at the scale of a block, a neighborhood, or even the city.
We need an example.
Yes. So, for instance, the value generated by transforming, let's say, an underutilized or vacant urban lot or building into a public or community good, say a community garden, an urban farm, affordable housing, a cooperatively managed workspace, outweighs or at least competes with whatever value that structure would have, either being sold on the market or laying vacant and underutilized. And so one of the things about these spaces in relationship to communities is to talk about them in terms of what humans need. And again, all people in cities need to survive and flourish. They need housing, they need affordable housing, they need access to good food. So Professor Sassen talked about Detroit. I'm from Detroit, and a lot of what's happened there, although it's spotty and it hasn't scaled up, is that communities have turned some of the vacant, abandoned, burned out land into amazing urban farms, urban gardens. They've turned some of the abandoned structures into places where that can house homeless or that can serve other community functions. So characterizing those resources not as property that's privately owned by someone who's abandoned it, or even held publicly by the city because the private owner has a tax lien on it, but rather as a commons, this kind of property in transition that belongs to all of us who live in cities and who depend on cities, is a way of saying that the resource should be more accessible to a broader group of people, but in particular to those most vulnerable to expulsion. And not just available and accessible, but generative. This resource should be able to be used to generate other collective goods, such as housing, culture, arts, etc.
Yes.
Yes. Go
Clear. And yeah, very good. So this is a concept which helps us perhaps in trying to find answers of what to do about these expulsions.
Yeah, I think that, Sheila, the point that property is also critical for the disadvantaged or those who do not have particular amounts of power is a very important one, because it's true that the way I talked about property, it was a totally different circuit. Mm-hmm. But property is a very significant element. I was at a conference, I'm just curious to see what you think about this, where there was a whole bunch of legal scholars, some very fancy ones, you know what I mean by that,
Yes.
who were saying that property is sovereignty. This is evidently a kind of way of categorizing property in legal scholarship. I was very intrigued by it. And I don't know how does that connect to the notion of the commons? I think that here we're getting to an opposite, or is there something positive actually in this formulation, which sounds a bit, alarming to me?
So legal scholars have connected property not just to sovereignty, but to personhood, and also, again, to to community ties. That is to say, property is central to a number of things. Sovereignty, I think, and I haven't, I'm not that familiar with that concept, although I've seen it, but I'm not sure who was talking in that instance. It may be aligned with the notion that to have property is to be able to govern oneself and one's life. So
then it would connect to the commons.
Yes, and I don't think that. So I do think on some high conceptual level that that connects with the commons. But here's the thing about property in American law and in so much of the rest of the world, but not the entire world, is that the core of property rights is said to be the right to exclude, the right to hold and exclude others from the property. It's a complete and total life or right. And so in that sense, sovereignty is not a great concept for us.
Exactly.
In other parts of the world, and I've written about this, there are other ideas of property that are not tied to this notion of individual property rights, individual sovereignty, such as the social function of property, that property should serve a social function, that property should be limited not just by the government from outside, but the very core of property is not something that can be locked up into one owner forever, which is the system that we have. And in that sense, there are other legal scholars, progressive legal scholars, that have written about the social obligation, the social function of property. In Latin America, it's in a number of constitutions, in Italy, as well as in Germany and other constitutions. So we have this tension in, at least in the academic community, about what is property for and what are the norms. So I'm very much playing in the field of the more progressive wing of property scholars. Yes.
Yes. Let me bring in Christian from Rome. You will be here on the Thursday in Amsterdam.
Yes, I will.
Yes, sir, you will. Mr. Iaione, can you? So you've been here several times talking about the notion of the commons. In what sense? I mean, you are actually how do you say, put it into practice into Bologna. For those who still think it's a bit of an abstract notion, can you just say a few words on what you're doing in Bologna?
So I will start by some of the considerations that Professor Sassen has carried out in her work. This idea of an accumulation by savage sorting that is carried out by coalitions of predatory formations is not only in some way changing the urban landscape and also addressing in some way the ownership of the city. This is also, and this is something that Professor Sassen has underlined in several in different works. It's also expelling, for instance, migrants from their cities or from their land in their home countries. And that's why we now have in Europe also, as an effect of the land grabs, this huge wave of migrations. And this is something that we need to, what we don't see about, we don't see about this trend is that this is also linked to the migrations, and also all this amount of money that is flowing towards urban areas is also creating a new source of corruption. And the last thing is that it's of course creating community eradication, because as we have seen, if you have shell companies owning urban land, then you don't have any more citizens. You don't have any more people, real people that share the resource and collaborate to make the city more prosperous and more in some way is a place where solidarity can be cultivated. So being a scholar, a lawyer that is working on public policy and the government, I'm more on the government side than on the property side. What we try to do also with the help of Sheila in Italy, in Bologna in particular, is to empower the powerless, as Professor Sassen would say. So the idea to give some legal tools to offset this imbalance in legal creativity. because it's true. And I'm a repentant lawyer, because I used to work for these big law firms, international law firms, where they would invent all sorts of financial tools to transform land, urban land, basically into a commodity. Because that's what, the picture that was shown to us before. It's telling us exactly this thing, that urban land is by now a commodity. Is being sold and resold on financial markets many, many times by people that we don't even know who they are. And so what we try to do in Bologna is to come up with a creative legal framework to enable citizens. And I know that Professor Sassen is also in search for these new points in this trajectory of civil society movements that are trying to like Occupy movement and Citizen United in the UK, that are trying to build what we call the idea of the city as a commons rather than the city as a commodity. A city in which citizens are subjects and not rabbits. Because if you think about this application, TaskRabbit, which is celebrated as one of the most successful apps of the sharing economy, this is basically what the hyper-capitalism and the profit maximization trend is trying to do, is trying to transform citizens into rabbits rather than subjects. So these legal tools that are always different and diverse and adaptive and adapted to the local conditions are based on some key design principles that are basically three design principles. The first one is that we need to rewrite the social contract at the urban level. We need to go back to the history and to the origins of the medieval city, as Professor Sassen would say, when the city, who outlived other institutions like kingdoms and maybe even nation states in the future, basically were formed out of sorts of pacts of collaboration among all the forces operating at the local level. So if we start by redesigning urban democracy at the local level and create urban constitutions that in some form signal a new social contract between all the forces that are interested in keeping city alive instead of transforming city into dead pools, dark pools or dead resources, like
Thank you, Christian. Thank you, Mr. I try to find a point in in what you were saying. Can you respond to that? The question, he says, we need to make urban constitutions. We need to reinvent urban democracy. And we really need to go back to the medieval idea of the city, where people collaborate together and own together the city.
Right. Yes, yes, yes. The final point, the medieval, you know more about that than I do.
He lives nearby, you mean? In all these medieval cities, yeah.
But, and Italy certainly is exhibit number one, how it can be done. You don't have to love your neighbor, because it's also a fantasy, It's not, Americans often go from one extreme to the other. I don't mean Americans like Sheila Foster.
And yourself, yes.
But this de-romanticize the city and see it as truly an operational system that enables more people. Whereas if you de-urbanize the city, you are doing the opposite. No, I think that you said it so clearly that, yeah.
Well, it's always good for Christian to know that a person like Saskia Sassen totally agrees.
Thank you. It's an honor.
You make me feel.
It was also, in June we talked to Benjamin Barber, and he was also saying we should reuse or reinvent the city as a political actor in actually the world, for instance, solving climate change, because nation states won't do that. So all these discussions about the city make the city more and more important. And that would mean that we really have to understand how to stop these expulsions, and how the 248% in your slide, Amsterdam and
Amsterdam. You
Randstad.
remember that one, I can say.
Yeah.
Right.
We both did, didn't we? Yeah. I'm pointing to the Elderman here. So how can we stop that trend? Because it's really threatening, actually, the city as we know it.
Well, that is correct. I mean, there are a whole... This is a story that now goes back, 30 years. Now we are seeing it. I was already struggling with these facts. But it is true that a lot of the non-urban today needs an urban moment. And a lot of that I'm talking about are very powerful actors. So if you owned a mine 40 years ago, hey, you basically, it was a rather simple operation. Today, you are operating globally, probably, if you are still existing as a mining company. And that means that you need a lot of the kind of capabilities that a city offers. And you can mention this for any sector. Plantation agriculture, And so there is this weird way in which the city becomes a strategic space for all kinds of sectors that are not urban. So this is one point I want to put on the table. Secondly, this gets a bit complicated. I don't know if we want to do this at this time of the night.
We can handle it.
But let me start with a simple example. Germany exports 20,000 tons, or I can't remember the precise figure, of potatoes to the UK. The UK exports a similar amount of English potatoes to Germany. We need to ask, who benefits? The intermediaries. The farmers on each side are complaining that the prices keep going down.
Yes.
The intermediation, when I developed
probably through Amsterdam, but it doesn't matter.
Yeah, well, that too, right. Yeah. So maybe Rotterdam wins a few shipping operations, that's true. I mean, there are intermediaries that gain. The farmers, the original, makers of the product don't. So for me, the key global city function, many readers didn't understand this, is intermediation. Yeah. And so that means that a lot of the power logics that have enabled multiple actors, private actors clearly, big corporations, etc., financial firms, are actually, it's a very urban condition. Now that's one issue. The other issue is that national law has not caught up mostly with this. So the city is still seen as from a past period, rather than enabling government. So cities, are often struggling with budgets. They can't handle what is happening. So it is both a rise of power that is not necessarily positive power, and it is a loss in relative terms of resources to address all the issues that are playing out in cities. Climate change is another one. Climate change really makes itself felt in cities.
Yes.
That
is exactly why Benjamin Barber in the coming 2 weeks has this Parliament of Mayors. You are going to talk there, right, Sheila Foster?
Yes. Yeah. I'm on the
advisory board. And the first motion they're going to address is what can cities do to stop or act upon stopping climate change. Ms. Foster, let's see if we can make it really concrete. So you talked about abandoned buildings, getting, for instance, in Detroit, getting that into the communities. Are they also not owned by anybody, these properties? Because as Ms. Sassen said, all these corporate buyings of this property in London, but it's also happening in Amsterdam. She was talking about 12 grachtenhuizen. They are probably vacant, but they are owned by somebody. Yes. Can we do something with the notion of the commons to create community useful property there? How can we do that? Do we have to hack them? Do we have to squat them? What are we going to do?
I think this is why public policy is so important, and Christian was way too modest about the work in Bologna. But you're absolutely right that these are what I would call property in transition. They are technically owned by a private owner. And in many instances, the private owner has stepped away, not paid taxes. In the city, in some cities, so I'll talk about New York City. New York City has a tax lien that when property is abandoned and vacated and is in, tax arrears, it goes on this tax lien list. And the city can sell off those liens and make money from them. And so one of the things we're working on is changing that policy. So that some of those properties go back into the commons as a matter of policy. So in Bologna, the way that this is played out, so Christian talked about pacts of collaboration. And so one of the things that he worked on and I've been involved with on the margins there is a policy that the city would identify these kinds of opportunities for collaborations of residents or whomever else to take over some of these abandoned, underutilized properties and to enter into a pact of collaboration with the city to regenerate them. And the urban commons is defined very broadly in that piece of regulation that the city eventually embraced. So the commons does actually do some work, both in terms of the resource issue, how we characterize and classify this resource is neither private nor public in the sense that the city gets to act as an owner like it was a private owner, but public in the sense that it goes back into the commons. So the commons does work there, and it does work, I think, as a matter of governance, and that's what Christian, I think, was trying to hint at, and that is once it goes back into the commons, who gets to say what happens to it, right? There needs to be a more democratic process, a more democratic idea about how we manage the collective resources, the commons of the city. And so the idea of the commons is really designed to come up with policies, to come up with strategies to address both of those. And they're going to be different in different cities, in different political, legal, and economic systems. And so in our mind, the commons and what LabGov does is that it's really an experimental process. In every city, in every place, we need to figure out how to instantiate, how to make the commons real.
Yes.
So
I'll the only one who's applauding is actually Miss Sassen. Yeah, really important. Thank you. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, absolutely. Very good. You like the radical thinking, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sort of considered a radical thinker.
No,
No, but what she said, let's say that we succeed in bringing that the abandoned property into the commons, who's going to decide? And that tells you that there is probably, I mean, you correct me because, I'm not a lawyer, but there is probably no regime that takes care of that. So it is the will of whatever the authorities or whatever. Is it something like that or?
Christian,
No.
please come in.
yeah, go ahead.
That is why right after the regulation, we started working on the government, on the organization of the city government and the way it could create a dialogue with the local community. So now, in a few months away from the startup of this so-called Office for Civic Imagination, which is going to be a co-design, public policy co-design lab in which every policy and every asset in the city is going to be, the destination of every asset is going to be decided by pooling all the forces that want to take care of one specific asset or one specific service or one specific policy, and they are going to work together with the help of both
local experts, local governments.
And the idea is that.
Yeah, sorry, nobody could hear you anymore because of the bad internet connection. But
let me fill in for him a bit.
No, okay. Shortly.
Yeah, so what has happened in Bologna is to call forth what we call the 5 actors in a governance regime, and that's so in innovation studies there are 3 actors. There are knowledge institutions, the public, and then the private sector. And the other 2 that we've added are the unorganized public and also the innovators, the social entrepreneurs, and the people who are will be key in kind of regenerating and reusing the commons property. So it's a process that you have to design, and that's why the co-design with the city is important to get to what is the kind of governance that's inclusive and transparent around these resources that are common or collective resources.
Yes. So,
if I may add one.
No, thank you. No. Christian, 1 second. I'm going to introduce 2 other people to the stage who are part of these 5 groups you always talk about when you're talking about which resources, which people you have to get on the table to really change a property, a park, a thing in the common. One of the persons in Amsterdam who's really an inspiration for many people, who is a social entrepreneur. He started in a very tough area, we would say, or a situation in West, in the Baarsjes. And he started the initiative. Ik geef om de Jan Eef. I care about. Ik geef om de Jan Eef. And he calls himself a shopping street doctor. And he started recently, the next phase, he started a neighborhood cooperation. So in which you always mention the importance of the neighborhood. He started a neighborhood cooperation.
A cooperative or
yes,
a cooperation?
Yes, a cooperative. Cooperative. Please join us on stage. I'm talking about Amsterdam now, more specific. Jeroen Jonkers. You can sit over there. And the other person I want to join on stage, one of the 5 in collaboration in the governance of the common, we don't forget the government. The government is part of that group of 5, which needs to pool resources in understanding how to deal with or govern the commons. And we're honored that you're here, because you're not much on stage. Your colleagues sometimes more, but you're actually the one with the PhD. Arjan Vliegendhart, he's alderman of the city of Amsterdam, responsible for all social things in the city. Please come to the stage as well. Really great that you're here. Please. So, you have been waiting to join this conversation. Of course, you knew. We are now trying to get into the abstract analysis. Then we had some solutions, the commons, as a solution of fighting that trend Professor Sassen is describing as expulsions. And then we're trying to make it really concrete. And in Bollier that is happening, and we're also going to start a LabGov with the help of Christian Iaione in Amsterdam. But you, of course, both of you are actually part of that discussion. Can you respond? What is a neighborhood cooperative or corporation? What are you doing?
We are trying to buy real estate, shopping real estate, because we are worried about the future of the shopping street. Because we started when it was in decline, when a jeweler was shot and he died. And we achieved a lot in 5 years, but now we are afraid that in maybe 2-3 years, real estate owners will undo a lot of what we have done.
Yes, because they will raise the rents.
They are very happy with what we have done. Yes. They are thankful because their real estate has gone up. And now they will reap the fruits and change the street in a way that we do not like.
Who are these real estate owners? Were they the ones who were modest owners with losing value to their properties who were enabled by you, or are they a different cast of characters here?
It's a complex set. We have social housing corporations who have small plots of real estate, shopping real estate. But we have more than 60 different real estate owners in the shopping street. So it's a lot of them. And some of them are abroad. Many of them are in very large portfolios. They might be, but it's small. It's 1 or 2 shopping. Or,
yes,
yeah.
And now you're actually pooling all the resources, the money from this cooperative. You're asking neighborhood people to join you in that cooperative. Then you have a big bundle of money, and you're going to buy all these properties.
The big bundle is very slowly growing, but we are not in a hurry because the fundamental idea is very sound, and I think more and more people will see the importance of it in the coming. We now already see stores standing empty. We have wonderful shopkeepers who want to start at the Jan Eef. They cannot start because the owner does not want them in his building. He rather have the 5th haircutter for 5 or 6 months because he has other targets with the building.
Yes, very clear. This is, Christian, this is a good example, right, of what you are talking about, what needs to be done.
Right, this is exactly what we are talking about. Revitalize these spaces and try to make these spaces part of a renaissance on the edges, on the edges, because that's what we need to do, to work in the outskirts mainly.
Yes. Mr. Vliegendhart, it's not happening a lot, right, for an alderman to sit for 1.5 hours at a no.
Well, it's good for an alderman to
Yeah.
practice modesty every now and again. So that's good, and I've listened with great pleasure to your introduction, Saskia.
So do you recognize the images? Saskia Sassen is, of course, sketching on global developments, but she's also having Amsterdam in the charts. Do you recognize that these expulsions are threatening the city? Amsterdam?
If you walk through the inner city, I think it's hard not to see.
Yes,
what Saskia,
especially the central inner city, the grachtenpanden.
And we have got, the negen straatjes. And we see, of course, an interesting mixture too. On the one hand, what you describe, and an influx of tourism.
Yes,
that sets Amsterdam a little bit apart from much of what you say. But of course, it's visible.
Yes.
And there's a lot of things are going on, and people are feeling uncomfortable. I think that one of the things that I'm quite positive about is that inhabitants of neighborhoods, most people live in a city, but primarily live in neighborhoods. One of the most interesting ideas that I came across was when I spoke on a session on youth unemployment in the Baarsjes, in het Sieraad. I spoke to a youngster, 17 years old, and he said, I'm looking for an internship. I need the one-day internship. Yeah, well, you say, you can start at my office tomorrow morning. And he said, where is that? I said, it's at the Waterloopplein, it's City Hall. He'd never been there. He never been to the inner city. He lives in a neighborhood that's about 1 square kilometer. That's about what is the no, but that's what references are. And that I think is also happening.
What is an alderman actually? He asked you. The second question was, what do you actually do?
No, he was prepared to introduce me, so he had that one covered.
And the other question. So you recognize the image and also the risk for the city.
There's a sincere risk because in the end it gets empty at night. But also, it has a feeling that the city, as a power that emancipates people, is getting on the theft. Because people start powerless in cities, but they gain power, they gain voice, they gain interest in what happens. They get active, and in that sense, when we stop that development, then something is under threat. There's no problem, even from my perspective as a socialist, to say that there is inequality. I think that we need to do something about that. I think that's the second point. But that a city emancipates. We had the old saying that city air makes free, frees people from medieval ages onwards. And if that's under threat, then we might lose the possibility for many people in our country to actually step up a little bit in life.
Emancipate. Yeah. So you agree with the threat. And it has much more consequences for these powerless who come to the city to actually make history, as Professor Sassen is beautifully phrasing. And then we offer you a solution. And Ms. Sassen was applauding, actually, saying this is a great, interesting thing to research upon. Well, a few years ago, we could squat things which were abandoned for a year. Yep. It was allowed in the Netherlands. It was, I don't know how it's called, gedoogd. If a building was empty for 1 year, you could squat it. You could go in and go and live there. But that's not allowed anymore in the city. What is that the idea of the commons, the city as a commons? Is that something that triggers you in a solution?
And departing from the idea of squatting, I mean, you know that my party didn't favor the prohibition of squatting. No. So I can say that without any problem here. But the interesting deal was that when houses were empty, we would also use the law in order to make sure that it got used again. And what we see, and that is a tendency that goes beyond, let's say, Amsterdam, and it also goes beyond the Netherlands, is that the power of capital has become so dominant that it actually is able to impose its ideas and its interests as the common good. And I think that there we have the main problem, and then that manifests itself in cities, but it also transcends, and there you got, I think, the link between what we see here on the city ground and what's happening globally. And I think that we need to make work out of the promise that was there in the law, which was not a good law, but was not particularly a very bad one either. If we would have used the other end of that of the law, namely that we would actually do something with property that was left empty.
Yes, and we're not doing that.
And we're doing not sufficiently yet, no.
And how are you discussing that with your peers? I mean, for Ms. Sassen, probably doesn't follow local politics of Amsterdam, although it's really interesting.
I haven't gotten there yet.
No. So he's of the Socialist Party, but he's governing with the Liberals and I would say the Conservative Party.
So it's a bit messy, or is it great?
You would have to ask him.
It's both. It's messy. It's messy at times, but I'm still quite positive about what we achieve here.
Okay. So in that debate about this, how many times have you talked in your council of aldermen and the mayor about actually going to use that law to stop this?
We see increasing pressures also from society, as Jan Eva actually shows, that we need to do something about that. And in the end, I'm always happy to see that what happens on the ground also impacts on what we do. So I think that the discussion is there. Now in the city council, it started in the city council, and in the end it will also lead to new policies. But it's hard. It's hard to break the dominance of capital. I'm in that sense a real socialist. We have a tough fight to do there. And that's not an easy one, but it's one very much worth fighting for.
The interesting thing is that on the neighborhood level, the pain is more easily felt, and capital has moved away from the neighborhood. They don't feel it. Would that these owners lived in our neighborhood, we wouldn't have these problems.
Yeah, and that is what I want to ask Saskia. You've said quite several times, it doesn't matter that there are foreign buyers. I do think nationality and intrinsic connection to cities do matter in many respects. Not in general, but in practice, we see that Dutch owners they start living in the city at least half a year. Chinese never come here, and that's what you demonstrated. And it makes for the for a neighborhood, it makes quite a difference whether there's someone that lives actually there, or whether it's
that part is true,
kept empty. And I think that there is a relation between nationality there.
But see, one thing is occupying the property, and another question is a question of nationality. So for me, the emphasis is, number one, that it's corporate ownership, which means that very often it's empty, whether it's national or foreign, because national also has empty. The nationality issue it comes with a lot of baggage. When we say nationality, we're speaking about much more. You pulled out a very positive thing, that they might care more because it's also their city. In the United States, it maybe plays out a bit differently, or in London also, you know. But I sort of want to, part of the idea is to emphasize not the nationality question, because then immediately it enters a thick zone for the average person, and I don't want that deviation, you know. And so I emphasize the corporate ownership. Yes. And I think we all know, maybe that doesn't happen in the Netherlands, but you correct me, that corporate owners are often quite similar, I must say. You know, that there is a kind of indifference to certain issues that were brought by Foster and by Iaione, that's quite a name. Ma noi ci conosciamo, vero? O no?
Ci siamo incontrati.
Con la Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, mi ricordo, eri tu, no? Sì. So that was Italian.
Just checking whether they saw each other at a German conference.
Right, at a German, that's also a good combination.
Okay.
So anyhow, nationality is also, it's also a tactical move on my part, because you bring in so many other things.
Yes. Clear. Good answer.
You should be running a country, you know that.
Sorry for that. But Sheila Foster, The alderman is actually is referring to something in the law which he should use more often if buildings are vacant and not used for actually living or working there. What else should he really capture on the notion of the commons? And should he talk about, because he is responsible actually for those people, the modest people, the people without ownership in this city. He is the alderman for social affairs.
So he better listen carefully. Huh?
Yes. Ms. Foster, what does he have to grasp really well now before he sleeps tonight? To make it very concrete.
So I do think that use and access, which it sounds like the law grants, is an important part and perhaps even the core of the commons. But I also think, back to the previous discussion, this question about who uses, who accesses, and whether you have a mechanism for mediating those questions. So I wonder how the law, and I don't know the law, how do you decide and how do you mediate? Who are the users? What happens with the property? I think that's where the governance piece is actually exceptionally important, and why what happened in Bologna, the idea of PACs and the idea of a public and transparent process is important. And the other important thing I would say is that even commons, I don't want to romanticize commons. I mean, even commons can become what we call ossified, hardened, and work against the very goals that we want, equality, inclusion, etc. If they do become hardened into their own kinds of institutions, they too can exclude, they too can be used toward dark purposes, and we've seen that in the history of the commons. So I think it's so again, the governance piece of it, and the fact that the city as a public authority is a mediator and holds the public values like anti-discrimination and inclusion is a very important part of whatever you do legally and as a policy matter in managing and governing the urban commons.
Thank you. Now you can sleep tonight.
Can I add just one
do you want to
thing?
add something? Yeah, sorry.
This is a formal invitation to Professor Sassen to Italy, because it's Bologna, but it's not just Bologna. The thing is going viral. The idea that you can change the law from the ground up is becoming something that Tuscany region is embracing. Other cities like Reggio Emilia and Rome and Naples are working along these lines. So really, law can make a difference from the ground up also.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sorry.
We want to hear this.
Better hurry up, because 80 companies from Silicon Valley have asked to downsize the belastingen, but also
access.
More ruling. They want more ruling, so they can get also into cities more.
Yeah, actually it was in the newspaper. There was a letter from the big Silicon Valley corporations to the Netherlands government. Please lower your taxes, otherwise we will not come into your country. Yeah. Of course, and they wanted special treatment rulings. Okay. Yeah.
They do this a lot.
A lot. It happens.
Either
it's not
very
new.
public. This is what is unusual here, is a big public statement, because partly because they are tech companies, because there is a whole fantasy about economic growth, about whatever great careers around tech. Whereas if you said, manufacturing, I don't know, something that is actually really necessary for survival, they might not react with, you know what I mean, right? So, but it is very disturbing. It is another indication of what has come out in this conversation, which is the power of big economic sectors, to launch agendas in a way that you said that too, I think, or somebody said it, that other agendas have a lot of trouble taking off. And so that the Bologna case is just great. How that is capturing imaginations through those digital technologies. Partly it goes global, which is also sympathetic here.
Yes.
Right. No, but the big corporates really have a kind of authoritative thingy about them. But I think they're losing ground, which is the only hopeful.
In some places they actually are. It's really important, I think, if the idea of the city as an incomplete, complex system, where people without power can make history, right? The people you actually represent or have to make policies for in your daily work, that this is connected to each other. Is that on top of your mind now?
Well, yeah, one thing which is on top of my mind, I mean, when we started out, we got 20 million a year extra for combating poverty, this city council, and we were well on track getting that money to the people that actually are entitled to that. What I find more difficult, and what I also would like to hear Sheila comment on from a perspective of the commons, is how do we make sure that those voiceless people get a voice? The commons is probably mostly consist of people that are relatively well educated. They already have their voice, and they organize their neighborhoods, and they might actually organize them for. But how do we organize them with these people so that they get a voice rather than that they are paternalized and get a little bit of the bread that's falling from the table?
Ms. Foster.
Absolutely. I think this is a key question. And I mean, my personal agenda is always to put some, to bring this perspective to the commons conversation. And I think it's important. And the way that you do it is, and it's a missing piece that we've talked about, is that these are the folks that are vulnerable and marginalized and left out for a reason. And you have to not only bring them in, but you have to transfer resources to them. And it's another part of the Bologna policy that's important, is not that you invite people in to collaborate and to do this, because who ends up coming are the people with the resources, including the time and the technical know-how, et cetera. But you actually have to increase the capacity of people who are normally left out. You have to be more and I'll use an academic term, normative about this than neutral about this. You have to be targeting the people that are on the margins as part of this policy and as part of inclusion. And that's a key part of this, and you have to give them resources. So the city transfers technical and other resources in Bologna, and that's the model that we envision.
Yes, please. No, I wanted to remind Christian of something. When this is, of course, an important debate. What is actually, for who is this use of commons? And Christian said once here in Pakhuis de Zwijger, well, if it's not inclusive, if it's not for those who are marginalized, then we have to drop the idea, because it's exactly what we already have in different in a different format, right? I mean, it has to be inclusive or it won't be successful. It won't happen.
And that is why you need the state. We cannot eliminate the state from this equation. The role of the state and the city government should be exactly this: to include, to reach out to those that are usually excluded from participatory processes, or from this kind of tech-based processes, digital processes that have the problem of digital divide, for instance. So we need the state to act positively, to include those who live on the margins, on the edges, as in the language of Professor Sassen.
So I wanted to say that I have started a project on digital applications, so very modest, doctoral students, not commercial, for the needs of low-income neighborhoods and low-wage workers. And that one essential feature of supporting low-wage workers, which in the case of the United States are really in deep trouble. No respect, I mean, it's terrible. And so in doing that research project, I found how few applications there are which are actually of use to that kind of population. And we now have a long list of little apps. And let me just give you one little example to talk. This is little stuff, which makes a difference. So one of my favorites is called, it's not my title, the emergency nanny. The nanny, the nanny term? I don't know what you say in Dutch, but anyhow, the emergency nanny. The emergency nanny is a little app. You are a low-wage worker, you're on your job, you get a call, crisis at home, you know, the aunt didn't come to take care of the sick grandma or the children, whatever. You click on that little app. In the context of the United States, you are not allowed to take out a phone and start making all kinds of calls. That little app mobilizes, and then you're out of the, you know, you just delegate, so to speak, mobilizes those people you have chosen, you woman, you man working, etc., that you trust, you know, and that are local, that are stationed in the neighborhood. The hairdresser, the one who sells little bits, the butcher.
Good idea.
Yeah,
Beautiful
I mean,
app.
some people might not think that having the butcher taking care of whatever is the good idea, but you know, I mean, there. And secondly, this is an unromantic project because I really don't believe in romanticizing, and I'm very curious to see how you brought together your project. So this is practical. This is not about, you know, but I say this is a first little step, and this is the same for all the other apps, that begins to feel like the butcher feels, hey, I'm not just a butcher. I'm actually part also of a little group, you know, that blah, blah. And so slowly, because my experience is in these low-income neighborhoods, that often the hatred is towards your neighbor. Because it's also the poverty of options as to whom you can hate. You know, I mean, we're talking desperate situations. And anyhow, I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, please, because I asked Christian, your initiative is an example of what we are talking about. How do you make sure that your initiative is inclusive?
We identified, for instance, this last year the new.
He will answer the question.
The new ground, you know, the new set of experimentations that we're going to run. That public housing in the outskirts was the ground where we should experiment to reach out to those who live, low-income families that live in these public housing complexes. So what we did was to create sort of social pools in which people start, you know, sharing the basic resources and the basic needs that they have to reach a common goal. So, for instance, in one of these neighborhoods, we use the commercial spaces as a sort of laboratory to start an collaborative economy circuit in which all the actors on the ground are part of a sort of economic circuit, in which they are going to self-develop themselves with the support, of course, of the other actors, but with the idea that is community-driven, that is this social pool in the neighborhoods, in the outskirts, that is in the modest neighborhood, as Professor Sassen called them, that is going to be driven by the community and not by other actors.
Yes. Meneer Vliegendhart has to go to Bologna, let's share. But now I'm going to ask the question to Mr. Jonkers. Yes.
I think every group works out differently. So you can really trust some groups. They are great. They have very warm-hearted goals. And these people are also in it for the long run, for 10, 20 years. Their neighbors know how they act and what they really want. These people you can trust blindly to be inclusive. Other groups will be exclusive, and then you can choose not to cooperate with them.
Yeah, of course.
There will be a sort of competition of the commons even then.
Yeah, and of course, Ms. Foster already said the commons are not like the Holy Grail. I mean, they can also transform into something you don't want them to transform.
We were almost driven away from some stores in the beginning because the angry shopkeeper thought we were from local government.
Yeah. You look too much like a civil servant sometimes. Yeah. Okay. It's 3 minutes past 10. It's hot. I would like first, I thank you for Jeroen Jonkers and Arjan Vliegendhart for their participation, short participation in this conversation. Give them a thank you. Then, because I don't know if many of you Skype a lot, but being in a public debate or discussion over Skype for almost 2 hours, longer than 2 hours, is an amazing thing to do because it's really tiresome. Technical things can happen and stuff, and you need to really focus. So thank you so much, Christian Iaione from Rome and Sheila Foster.
Thank you, Natasha. Thank you, Professor Sassen.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
And then let me just first say, yesterday she said she was actually now proud to be of Dutch heritage. Somehow everybody now thinks the Dutch are really great, and so you always, you now say sometimes you're Dutch.
No, I have never denied being Dutch. No. What I said, that I have noticed over the last 10 years, I think it started with the Katrina disaster when the Dutch came. It was not the hurricane that created, you know that famous moment. It was the quality of those so-called, whatever they are called, right? And so there has been, and then Henk Ovink added, you know, to the whole, etc. Yeah. But no, I have never had an issue.
No, you didn't deny you were Dutch, but now you're very proudly announcing everybody you're Dutch.
I wouldn't quite
American.
put it that way either, actually. I must say. I just, you know, hey, do you make a big deal out of being Dutch? No, we are what we are a bit. Those are inherited conditions for...
Unfortunately, it's true. But she's only here for a few days, but she's worked so hard. Give her a big thank you. Saskia Sassen. Okay, so the 3 books are in the library of Pakhuis de Zwijger, if you want to borrow them. And she said, if there is somebody in the audience, you don't have to raise your hand now, because I'm not going to ask, really, are you really that poor? No. But if there's somebody from the audience who says, but I can never pay for a book like that, she's offered, she volunteers you to get that copy and send us a new copy. So if you really think you should, you come to me and say, I really am that person, then I'm going to give you the book. No public people, we're not going to do that publicly. There's going to be tons of evenings and events the coming year, of course, in Pakhuis de Zwijger. This was the first. Thank you so much for attending, and I hope to see you soon.
And I want to say, I want to celebrate you. You are a force of nature. You may not know that about yourself.